The smell hit me first. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late November, the kind of cold that settles into southern Ontario and refuses to leave until April. I had driven 3 hours from my place in Kingston to visit my mother in Hamilton, and when I pushed open the front door of the house where she had lived for 31 years, what I noticed before anything else was the smell. Stale air, something faintly sour, the particular stillness of a space that has not been properly lived in for a very long time. "Mum?" I called out. She answered from the living room, her voice smaller than I remembered. "In here, Daniel." I found her sitting in the armchair closest to the window, wrapped in 2 blankets despite the fact that she was indoors. She was wearing her winter coat. Inside her own home, the television was off. The curtains were half drawn. The lamp on the side table was not on, and in the gray afternoon light filtering through the gap in the curtains, she looked like a woman I almost did not recognize. My mother, Sylvia Okafor Brennan, was 68 years old. She had been a secondary school librarian for 27 years in the Hamilton Wentworth District School Board. She was the woman who had driven me to hockey practice at 5 in the morning without a single complaint for 6 winters in a row. She was the woman who had learned to use a tablet computer at 64 because she wanted to video call her grandchildren without asking anyone for help. She was not a small woman in any sense of the word, and yet sitting there in that chair with the blankets pulled up to her chin, she looked diminished in a way that frightened me immediately. "Why is it so cold in here?" I asked. "It's fine," she said. "I have my blankets." I walked to the thermostat on the wall. It read 14 degrees Celsius. In November. In Canada. "Mum, this is set to 14. The heating costs a lot," she said, and she said it in a tone that suggested she had rehearsed the answer, that it was a line she had been given rather than a thought she had formed herself. I stood there for a moment looking at her. Then I went to the kitchen. I don't know exactly what I expected to find, but I know what I found. The refrigerator contained a partial container of margarine, 3 eggs, half a carton of milk that was 2 days from its best before date, and a jar of pickles. The cupboards held a bag of rice, a tin of tomato soup, some tea bags, and a nearly empty box of crackers. There was no meat. There were no vegetables. There was no bread. There was a single orange sitting in a bowl on the counter that had begun to go soft on one side. My mother received a pension of $7,200 a month. She had worked for the school board for 27 years, and when my father passed away 4 years ago, she had also begun receiving his survivor benefits. Between everything, she brought in more money every single month than most working families in Hamilton, and her refrigerator held 3 eggs and a jar of pickles. I went back to the living room. "Mum," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage, "when did you last have a proper meal?" She looked away from me toward the window. "I had soup yesterday." "Soup from a can?" "It was fine." "Mum, I don't want to make a fuss, Daniel." I pulled a chair close to her and sat down. I looked at her hands where they gripped the edge of the blanket, and I noticed for the first time how thin they were. My mother had always had strong hands, capable hands. These hands looked like they belonged to someone 20 years older. "I need you to tell me what is happening," I said. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a car drove past on the street, and the sound of it faded, and the house went silent again. "Your brother-in-law handles the finances," she finally said. "Since your father died, he said it was easier. He said I shouldn't have to worry about bills and payments and all of that." My brother-in-law. My sister Pauline's husband. A man named Trevor Ashe. I want to be honest about something. When I heard those words, my first reaction was not anger. It was something colder and slower, more like the feeling you get when you realize you have been standing at the edge of something dangerous without knowing it. A kind of retroactive dread. Because I had known, in a vague and unexamined way, that Trevor had taken on some kind of administrative role in my mother's affairs after my father died. My sister Pauline had mentioned it on the phone once, maybe 18 months earlier. She had said something like, "Trevor's been helping Mum sort out the financial stuff. It's just easier for everyone." And I had said, "That's good of him." And I had moved on with my life because I was 3 hours away and I had my own family and I trusted my sister. I had trusted my sister. I stayed that night instead of driving back. I made my mother a proper dinner from groceries I went out to buy, and while I cooked, I kept asking her questions, gentle questions. Nothing that would make her feel accused of anything, because she had that look people get when they are braced for someone to be angry with them, and they are not sure they can bear it. What I learned over the course of that evening was this. Approximately 3.5 years ago, 2 months after my father's funeral, Trevor had suggested that he take over the management of my mother's finances. He had framed it as a kindness. She was grieving, he said. She shouldn't have to deal with all of this on top of everything else. He would set up automatic payments, manage the accounts, make sure everything ran smoothly. My mother, who was in fact grieving deeply and who had never managed the household finances on her own because my father had always done it, said yes. The pension deposits went into her existing checking account. Trevor had himself added as a joint account holder. Then, within a few months, he had suggested that it would be more efficient to have the pension direct deposited into a different account, one that he had set up, and from which he would transfer her a household allowance each month. The household allowance was $300. $300 a month. For a woman receiving over $7,000 a month in pension income. The rest, he told her, was going toward the mortgage, utilities, property taxes, insurance, groceries, maintenance. He showed her spreadsheets sometimes, she said. They looked very official. She didn't really understand them, but they looked thorough, and she didn't want to seem ungrateful, and she didn't want to cause problems between her daughter and her son-in-law, and she was so tired after your father died, Daniel. I was just so tired, and it seemed easier to let someone else handle it. So she had let him handle it for 3.5 years. I did not sleep well that night. In the morning, I drove to the Service Canada office and sat in the waiting room for 40 minutes, and when I finally spoke to someone, I explained the situation and asked how I could find out where my mother's pension deposits were currently going. They told me I needed my mother's authorization and specific documentation. I drove back to the house, picked up my mother, and we went together. What we learned at that appointment confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. The pension deposits had been redirected by authorization form to an account that was not my mother's primary account. The authorization had been signed 3.5 years ago. My mother said she remembered signing something around that time, but that Trevor had told her it was just a form to simplify the administration. She had signed it without reading it carefully. She had trusted him. I want to pause here and say something about my mother's character, because I think it matters. Sylvia Okafor-Brennan is not a foolish woman. She is not naive. She spent nearly 3 decades working with young people, and she had excellent judgment about character. But she was 64 years old and newly widowed, and she was in a grief that went deeper than she had been willing to show any of us. And Trevor had been patient and methodical and had framed everything as help, as care, as love for his wife's mother. He had not come at her with aggression. He had come at her with spreadsheets and a sympathetic voice and the slow, steady removal of every tool she might have used to see what was actually happening. That is how these things work. That is something I did not understand until it happened to my own family. I called my sister Pauline that afternoon from the driveway of my mother's house. I had decided not to go inside for this conversation because I did not want my mother to hear it until I understood what I was dealing with. Pauline answered on the second ring. "Daniel," she said, and she sounded cautious already, as though she had been half expecting this call for some time. "I'm at Mum's," I said. "I know. She told me you were coming. Do you know that the thermostat in her house is set to 14 degrees? Do you know that she has 3 eggs in her refrigerator? Do you know that she is wearing her coat inside?" Silence. "Pauline, Trevor handles all of that," she said, and her voice had gone stiff. "He manages the household budget. There have been a lot of expenses. The roof last year and the teepee. She gets over $7,000 a month," I said. "Where is it?" "Daniel, you don't understand the full picture. Then help me understand it. Because from where I'm standing, our 68-year-old mother is sitting in a 14-degree house with nothing to eat, and her pension has been redirected to an account that Trevor controls, and I am having a very hard time understanding how any of this is acceptable." There was a longer silence. Then Pauline said, "I think you need to talk to Trevor." "I think," I said very carefully, "that I am going to talk to a lawyer first." I heard her breath catch. "Daniel, please don't make this into something. Call me when you're ready to have a real conversation," I said, and I hung up. I want to be honest again here. I was not calm. I was not the composed, measured person I am describing. I sat in my car in my mother's driveway for about 10 minutes, doing the kind of breathing you do when you are trying very hard not to cry or scream, and then I went inside and made my mother a cup of tea and told her that I was going to help her sort this out, and that she didn't have to worry, and that none of this was her fault. She looked at me when I said that last part, and her eyes got very bright, and she said, "I should have told you sooner." "Yes," I said, gently, "but we're here now." Over the next 48 hours, I did not go home. I called my wife in Kingston and explained the situation, and she told me to stay as long as I needed to, and she is a good person, and I am grateful for her. I made an appointment with a lawyer in Hamilton who specialized in elder law. I had found her name through the Law Society of Ontario's referral service, and her name was Frances Delacroix Wu, and she was thorough and precise, and she did not minimize what I was describing. She listened to everything I had to say, asked a series of very specific questions, and then she told me that what I was describing was, on the face of it, financial elder abuse, and that there were several potential avenues, including a civil claim for the recovery of funds, a complaint to Adult Protective Services, and potentially a referral to police for fraud. That last word hung in the room for a moment. Fraud, I repeated. If the funds were redirected with the intent to deprive your mother of access to her own income, Frances said, yes, that is potentially fraud. She also told me something else that I have thought about many times since. She said that financial elder abuse by family members is one of the most underreported and under-prosecuted crimes in Canada. She said that victims are often reluctant to come forward because they love the people who are harming them, or because they are ashamed, or because they have been isolated so gradually and so thoroughly that they no longer trust their own perception of what is happening. She said that by the time family members notice, the damage is usually significant. In my mother's case, based on the pension amounts and the period of time, the potential misappropriated funds totaled somewhere between $250,000 and $300,000. I had to ask Frances to say that number again. While I was sitting in Frances Delacroix Wu's office, my phone rang 3 times. The first 2 times it was Pauline. The third time it was a number I didn't recognize. I ignored all 3 and called them back from the parking lot afterward. Pauline again. She had apparently spoken to Trevor. Trevor, according to Pauline, had a full accounting of all expenditures and was prepared to show me everything. All the money had gone to legitimate household expenses. The roof replacement alone had cost $40,000. There had been the furnace, the fence, property taxes. Everything was documented. I was misunderstanding the situation. I was upsetting Mum unnecessarily. I was causing damage to her marriage. Why was I always like this, Daniel? Like what? I asked. Always looking for problems. Pauline, I said, I am going to ask you one direct question, and I need you to answer me honestly. Does Mum have access to her own pension money? Can she go to a bank right now and withdraw money from her own account? A pause. A very long one. She has her allowance, Pauline finally said. Her allowance, I repeated. She's 68 years old, Pauline. She is not a child receiving an allowance. Trevor he wanted to make sure she didn't have to worry about. Stop, I said. Just stop. I need you to think about what you are defending right now. Really think about it. I went back to my mother's house. I sat with her at the kitchen table, and we went through everything together. She showed me the bank card she had, which was connected to a small account into which Trevor had been depositing $300 a month. I looked at her transaction history. In the past 12 months, she had spent money on tea, crackers, margarine, rice, soup, and one purchase at Shoppers Drug Mart that I recognized as the generic blood pressure medication her doctor had prescribed. She had not been to see her doctor in over a year because she said she didn't want to spend the money on transit. My mother had not been to the doctor in over a year for blood pressure medication that could not safely be left unmonitored. The next morning, I took my mother to her bank, not the one where the redirected account was held, but the bank where she had her original account. I had spoken to Frances the night before and knew what we needed to do. We opened a new account in my mother's name only, with no secondary holders and no access of any kind granted to anyone else. We had her pension benefits redirected back to this new account through the proper Service Canada forms, with my mother present and providing her own authorization. The Service Canada officer who processed the change was a woman named Deborah, and she was kind, and she went through every step carefully to make sure my mother understood exactly what she was signing and why. When it was done, my mother sat in the chair across from Deborah's desk, and she straightened up, and I watched something come back into her face. It is hard to describe. It was not dramatic. She didn't cry. She just sat up a little straighter, and she looked like herself for the first time since I had arrived. I also, on Frances's advice, made a report to Hamilton Police Service. This was not a decision I came to easily. Trevor was married to my sister. Whatever happened next was going to affect Pauline. I did not make the report without acknowledging that to myself and sitting with it for a long time. But my mother had been cold for 3 winters. My mother had been hungry. My mother had gone without her blood pressure medication being properly monitored for over a year. And approximately $300,000 that belonged to her had gone somewhere, and I needed to know where. I made the report. The officer I spoke to took a full statement and told me that a financial crimes unit would be in touch. He also told me that in situations involving elder financial abuse by family members, victims sometimes recant or refuse to cooperate once the initial shock of intervention passes, and he asked me gently whether my mother understood the implications of the report. I said I didn't know yet, but that I was going to talk to her. I went home to the house, and I sat with my mother for a long time. I told her everything. I told her about the amounts, about the account redirection, about what Frances had said, about the police report. I told her that nothing about any of this was her fault. I told her that what had happened to her had a name, and that the name was financial elder abuse, and that it happened to a lot of people in this country, and that being a victim of it did not mean she was foolish or weak. She listened to all of it without speaking. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Will this hurt Pauline?" "It might," I said honestly. "I don't know yet what Trevor did and didn't do on his own, and what Pauline knew. I don't know the full picture yet. She's my daughter," she said. "I know. But she let this happen." She said that last part very quietly, and I didn't answer because it wasn't really a question. What happened over the following months was not simple or clean or satisfying in the way that these things sometimes are in stories. I want to be honest about that. Trevor retained a lawyer and maintained for several weeks that all funds had been used legitimately for household expenses. His lawyer produced documentation, the roof replacement receipts, the furnace, the fence, property tax records. These were real expenses. They totaled, by my mother's lawyer's accounting, approximately $68,000 over 3.5 years. That left, at minimum, a gap of approximately $180,000 that was not accounted for by legitimate household expenses. Further investigation by the Financial Crimes Unit found that Trevor had, over the same period, made a number of significant personal expenditures: a vehicle purchase, renovations to a rental property he co-owned with a business partner, several vacations, his daughter from a previous relationship's university tuition. None of these were expenses related to my mother's household. None of them were authorized by my mother. He was charged with fraud over $5,000 and criminal breach of trust. I am going to say something about my sister here, and I am going to say it as plainly and honestly as I can. I do not know how much Pauline knew. That is the truth. I have asked myself this question more times than I can count. The investigators asked her the same question at length. What she knew, according to the investigation, was that Trevor managed our mother's finances. She knew there were spreadsheets. She knew there was a household allowance. What she claims not to have known was the full extent of the diversion, or how little was actually being left for our mother. Whether that is true or not is something I may never know with certainty. She was not charged. What I know is that she had not visited our mother in 4 months before I arrived. What I know is that when she did visit, she apparently brought groceries, which I initially found somewhat exculpatory until my mother, in a quiet moment, told me that Trevor had started coming along on those visits about 2 years ago, and that conversations with Pauline alone had become rare. Isolation. It is not always dramatic. It is not always a locked door. Sometimes it is just a husband who always happens to be there. Trevor pleaded guilty to a reduced charge 8 months after the investigation began. He was ordered to make full restitution of $162,000, placed on 2 years of probation, and given a conditional sentence that kept him out of prison. My mother was in the courtroom for the sentencing, and she sat next to me, and she held my hand very tightly, and when it was over, she said, "Good," and she stood up, and she walked out. My mother's health, I should tell you, required more attention than we had realized. When she finally saw her doctor, her blood pressure was dangerously elevated. She had lost 11 pounds from her usual weight. She was mildly anemic. These things were not irreversible, but they required months of careful management, dietary changes, adjusted medication. Her doctor was, to put it gently, not pleased about the gap in her care. She filed her own report with the local health authority about the failure of adequate care. My mother lives differently now. She moved out of that house 18 months ago. The house was hers, had always been hers, and she sold it and used the proceeds, combined with the restitution payments, to purchase a smaller and more manageable condominium in Burlington, closer to me and my family. She manages her own finances entirely. She has a financial planner, a professional one, not a family member, who reviews her accounts with her every quarter. She understands every document she signs before she signs it. She has also, with what I think is considerable courage, begun volunteering with a seniors advocacy organization in Hamilton 1 day a week, where she talks to other older adults about what happened to her and about what to watch for. She says she talks to women in particular because women of her generation were often, as she was, the partner who did not manage the household finance, and that this can become a vulnerability in widowhood that no one warns you about. She and Pauline are not close. They are in contact. There is a relationship, fragile and carefully maintained, because my mother is not a person who closes doors completely. But it is not what it was, and I do not think it will be what it was, and I think my mother has made a kind of peace with that. There are things I want to say to anyone who is reading or listening to this, and I want to say them plainly because I think they matter. Financial abuse of older adults by family members is one of the most common forms of elder abuse in Canada, and it is one of the least reported. Statistics Canada estimates that the vast majority of cases are never brought to the attention of authorities. The reasons are the ones you might expect: love, shame, not wanting to cause trouble, not wanting to hurt the family, not understanding that what is happening has a name. If you are an older adult and someone has offered to manage your finances for you, please know this: kindness and control can look identical in the early stages. The difference becomes visible only when you try to access your own money and find that you cannot. Your pension, your savings, your investments belong to you. You are entitled to see every transaction. You are entitled to understand every document before you sign it. You are entitled to say no, or to change your mind, or to ask for a second opinion. These are not demands. These are rights. If you are a family member of an older adult, please visit in person. Visit alone when you can, without partners or spouses present. Ask direct questions. When did you last have a full meal? Can you show me your bank account? Do you have access to your own money? Are you warm enough? These questions may feel intrusive. Ask them anyway. The cost of not asking is far higher than any awkwardness. There are resources available in every province. The Law Society of Ontario and its equivalents in other provinces have elder law referral services. The Canadian Centre for Elder Law provides information and support. The Seniors Safety Line in Ontario can be reached at any time. Adult protective services in every province can conduct welfare checks and investigations when there is concern. My mother told me, the day we opened her new account, that she had felt for 3 years like she was slowly disappearing, like she was becoming someone with no weight in the world, no agency, no presence. She said that signing her name on those forms, with no one else's name beside hers, was the first time in 3 years that she felt like herself. She is 68 years old. She has, with any luck, decades ahead of her. She is learning, she says, to take up space again. I am proud of her for that, and I am sorry every single day that I did not come sooner, that I did not ask the right questions, that I said that's good of him and moved on with my life. If there is one thing this experience has given me, beyond the grief and the anger and the long, difficult work of rebuilding, it is this. Checking in is not enough. You have to look. You have to ask. You have to be willing to hear an answer you did not want to hear and to act on it even when acting is hard and even when the consequences will be complicated and even when the person causing harm is someone you once trusted. Completely. My mother is warm now. Her refrigerator is full. She calls me on Tuesday evenings and we talk for half an hour about nothing in particular, and her voice sounds like her voice again. That is what I was fighting for. It was worth every difficult moment to get here.